Thanks to at home for joining us this hour. Very happy to have you with us. Let us start with a simple thing. Let us start with a news development that is almost pure in its simplicity and its straightforwardness and its crystal clear implications for what should happen and what likely will happen next. I find this comforting. As a news story, this is just kind of perfect. The way like a pecan pie is perfect, or a sunrise, right? All right. Today, this news story I have found has been sort of my order in the midst of chaos. You ready to becalm yourself with me right now? All right. Right now, the White House Chief of Staff is John Kelly. He is the second White House Chief of Staff in less than 2 years. He replaced the first one, Reince Priebus. But now Mr. Kelly has also been fired, just as Reince Priebus was. And so now a third White House Chief of Staff will be coming in soon. John Kelly is expected to leave his post in January. When he initially took over his job, you may remember, he came over from the Department of Homeland Security, where Trump had appointed him to be Homeland Security Secretary. When he left Homeland Security and came over to the White House to be Chief of Staff, he brought with him a young staffer who had worked with him very closely at Homeland Security. His name is Zach Fuentes. And Zach Fuentes is 36 years old. And when John Kelly left Homeland Security, became the new White House Chief of Staff, he brought Zach Fuentes with him, and he gave Zach Fuentes a really good job. Mr. Fuentes became Deputy White House Chief of Staff, which sounds like a big deal. That is a big job in its own right. But because of the way Zach Fuentes got the Deputy Chief of Staff job, because of his close association with John Kelly, now that John Kelly has been fired, there is a widespread expectation that Deputy Chief of Staff Zach Fuentes will also have to go too. See, this is all very simple, right? This is like a placid news story. It's almost normal. Even when the scandal part kicks in, it's still kind of a normal scandal. It's at least a very knowable, very simple scandal. According to the New York Times today, even though there have been these widespread expectations that Zach Fuentes would leave the administration when John Kelly does next month, Mr. Fuentes has apparently been working on an alternate plan. Quote, Mr. Fuentes told colleagues that after his mentor, John F. Kelly, left his job as Chief of Staff at the end of the year, he would, quote, hide out at the Eisenhower Executive Office building adjacent to the White House for 6 months. Why would the Deputy White House Chief of Staff want to hide at the Eisenhower Executive Office building, and specifically for 6 months? Well, it turns out the timing here is crucial. According to the Times, Mr. Fuentes wanted to hide out for 6 months, quote, remaining on the payroll, in a nebulous role, meaning he wouldn't have much work to do. But then, quote, in July, after his 6 months of hiding out, he would hit his 15-year benchmark for his service in the Coast Guard. Because while Mr. Fuentes has been serving as Deputy White House Chief of Staff, he has also been an active duty Coast Guard officer. And if this plan of his worked, if he could successfully hide out and stay on the payroll, even if he didn't really have a job, for 6 more months after John Kelly leaves in January, that would put Zach Fuentes on track to hit the 15-year mark at the Coast Guard. And that would allow him to, quote, take advantage of an early retirement program at the Coast Guard. And it might have worked. He might have been able to burrow into the paneling somewhere and stay on the payroll for 6 months with nobody noticing that his mentor and his boss was gone and he was no longer doing anything. If he could just hit that 15-year benchmark, essentially vest into the retirement at the Coast Guard, he could retire at the age of 37. Boom, right? Excellent. There's just one problem, though, with this plan. Quote, the program, referred to as Temporary Early Retirement Authority, had lapsed for Coast Guard officers at the end of the 2018 fiscal year, which totally screws up this plan, right? It's one thing if he's going to burrow in and hide on the payroll for 6 months, but without this program, he would have to do that for 5 years, right? That would be harder. And so put yourself in Mr. Fuentes' shoes. If this was your scam, if this was your plan, what would you do when confronted with this terrible fly in the ointment, that the early retirement program you were going to take advantage of, that you only needed to bridge 6 months to, that early retirement program is gone? Well, here is apparently what Mr. Fuentes did. Quote, administration officials say that Mr. Fuentes discussed the early retirement program with officials at the Department of Homeland Security. In November, quote, Department of Homeland Security officials began pressing Congress to reinstate the early retirement program. And again, it almost worked. Just this past month, the Coast Guard, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, they packaged together a package of small tweaks and changes that they hoped would quietly pass through Congress without any controversy. These are just little technical matters, just little fixes. You know, put some colons in there that really should be semicolons. We got to go through and clean that up before it's official law. Well, when it came to the early retirement program, the justification for why the Coast Guard needed to suddenly revive and reinstate that program was, quote, the need for parity with other armed forces. Although we just need to, stay equal with what all the other armed services are doing here. We can't let this lapse exactly now. The proposed extension of that early retirement program also came with what appeared to be a sense of urgency. Quote, they also told the policy writers that there might be an immediate need for the early retirement authority and that it would be used at most for 10 individuals. Well, one guy named Zach and then, I don't know, a few, maybe just, I don't know if there's other guys, maybe him, maybe just him. Apparently, this did not raise any red flags at all with the Republican-controlled Congress. Quote, Representative Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania, the retiring chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, accepted the requested changes and this week introduced legislation in the House that would codify them into law. Psych! That means he got the retirement program extended. This means Zach is going to get to retire at 37. All he has to do is hide under a desk for 6 months without anybody noticing he's on the payroll without a job, and then he's going to get to It was on track. Bill Schuster accepted the requested changes. This week introduced legislation in the House that would codify them into law. It's totally going to work until somebody narked out Zach for what he was trying to do. And so now, thanks to these meddling New York Times reporters asking questions about it, it has all fallen apart. Quote, House lawmakers were preparing to push the package through the chamber on Wednesday, but confronted with questions about the early retirement extension, they decided to pull just that provision to ensure that the rest of the technical changes could become law. Perhaps my favorite part of all of this is the bullpucky supposed argument about why this change at the Coast Guard was no big deal, and the Coast Guard just needed to extend this little program right away just for a few officers, just as a technical matter. That argument that they would need to do that was that they needed to have parity with the other armed services, right, with the other services in the military. Apparently, nobody in Congressman Schuster's office, nor Congressman Schuster himself, nobody Googled that. Nobody fact-checked that argument. Because the Coast Guard reinstating that sweet early retirement program turns out would not give them parity with the other services. The U.S. Army, in fact, ended that exact same program last year and got a whole bunch of headlines for it. So when somebody snuck in the dead of night and said, Coast Guard needs to do this in order to match up with what the Army's doing, I'm sure that sounded good in theory, but literally just Google it. Just Google it. Google Army Early Retirement Program, and this is what pops up. Literally, these headlines just pop up immediately. Yeah, the Army just got rid of that. But apparently Congressman Schuster's office didn't Google it. Wasn't bothered. Didn't see anything wrong with this at all. So bottom line, this story in the New York Times, this scoop from the Times, is that the White House Deputy Chief of Staff may have been involved in a ham-fisted, county clerk embezzlement style scheme to change U.S. law and the policies of the U.S. Coast Guard just for a minute, just for him, specifically to give himself a sweet early retirement plan. And he almost did it, except now he has been caught. And this is what counts for beauty right now in American national politics, right? Because you could tell this kind of corruption story and you wouldn't even need the length of an after-school special. This one you could just tell as a paid public service announcement, right? In your civics textbook, when you get to the chapter on public corruption, subsection self-dealing, this could just be one of those shaded sidebars in italics. It's pocket-sized. It's simple. It's so tidy. We even know how this one ends. I mean, I don't know in this White House if trying to pull off a scam like this amounts to a firing offense. It's possible in this White House This is like one of the things you do to prove yourself. this is how you get your bones, and then you can move up once you've pulled off some sort of scam like this. Maybe that's how they run. But the Democratic Party is about to take over Congress, which means Republican Congressman Bill Shuster's House committee, which implicated itself in this scam by almost letting it happen. That committee, which is the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, it's not going to be headed up by Schuster anymore. It's going to be headed up by a Democratic pit bull named Peter DeFazio, whom we contacted for comment today about the story. We have not yet heard back from him, but we will let you know if we do. But if what happened here is in fact a, pocket-sized platonic ideal of corruption and self-dealing from the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, presumably this will be a matter of investigation under that committee when it gets its new leadership in a couple of weeks. Presumably they will investigate it and fix it. And if there is a crime here, they will make a criminal referral for prosecution. So, this is how I relax now. This is what counts as my happy place. It's like a relaxing, comforting turn in the news these days. This is, people upload to Twitter those pictures, those little GIFs of hedgehogs eating kernels of corn. And it's this is the equivalent of that. Oh, you can just zone out and think about this for a while. Oh, garden variety, potentially criminal public corruption at the highest levels of the White House staff. That feels like a place of rest right now, which is telling about what else is going on right now in the news. I mean, we expected to be getting on the air tonight without a clear story to tell about whether or not the entire federal government was going to shut down at midnight. We expected to be covering this hour ongoing wrangling and negotiations, potentially even last-minute votes. That is not the circumstances that we are in, because around dinner time, East Coast time tonight, the Senate just decided, yeah, we all know this thing's going to shut down anyway. Why fight it? Why stay up late? We're old guys. So there technically will be a partial government shutdown that initiates as of midnight tonight when funding for the government runs out. It's because there is no deal. There is no $5 billion for the president to build a wall or a moat or steel slats or a decorative pergola on the long southern land border between our country and Mexico. There's none of that. There's no deal. Senate's gone home. The House will convene tomorrow at midday. It is possible that they will then pass something that could shorten the shutdown, which means there are important questions now to ask and to figure out about how long the shutdown is likely to last. But there are really no questions left about whether or not we are going to have a shutdown. We will, in fact, have one. And we're going to be getting the latest news from Capitol Hill, both from a senator involved in the process and from an NBC crack congressional reporter coming up shortly. I will say, though, that the whole reason we are going through this ridiculous exercise is so the president won't be embarrassed when he watches the Fox News channel and they remind him about his campaign promises in which he said he was going to build a wall. I mean, I will just point out that if that's going to be the basis on which we shut down the federal government, there is this issue that his campaign promise, remember, was technically that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, right? If this whole fight right now was about whether Mexico was going to shut down their government rather than pay for the wall, that would be relevant to his previous campaign promises on this. He never promised, I'm going to build the wall and U.S. taxpayers are going to pay for it and Democrats are going to vote for that. That wasn't the campaign promise. That wasn't even what he said he could do. But the other part of this is that he's got a new incoming White House chief of staff. I mean, Zach is on his way to burrowing into the paneling for 6 months. but John Kelly, White House chief of staff, is on his way out. Supposedly the new guy who's going to be running the White House staff as of a few days from now is this guy, Mick Mulvaney, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, former South Carolina Republican congressman. Well, it does not signify the kind of commitment and united front and true belief you need to blindly follow a fairly insane, non-rational policy insistence like the one we're having right now if you're going to have a White House chief of staff who's on record saying this about the whole idea of a wall.
Donald Trump says, build a wall, deport all illegal immigrants. Rules are rules. You either play and stay or you cheat and you get deported. What challenges does this plan pose?
A bunch. I've never been in the boxcar caucus, ship them home in boxcars and let the Lord sort them out. The fence is an easy thing to sell politically. It's an easy thing for someone who doesn't follow the issue very closely to say, oh, well, that'll just solve everything. Build the fence. But to just say, build the darn fence and have that be the end of an immigration discussion is absurd and almost childish for someone running for president to take that simplistic view. It's easy to tell people what they want to hear. Build the darn fence, vote for me. It is pablum that politicians like to feed people in order to tell people what they want to hear as they're trying to get them to vote for them.
It seems to me that Donald Trump is trying to really win the emotional support of people.
But just to appeal to somebody's emotion and say, vote for me because I'm as angry as you are, doesn't really solve the problem.
It was a 2015 interview from incoming White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney that was first posted nationally by Andrew Kaczynski at CNN. But if, as the president says, he's going to get not just a shutdown, but a big, long shutdown of the federal government over this issue of not getting his wall, I think what's supposed to happen is that in the middle of that shutdown, he's going to get his new White House Chief of Staff, who is on record saying emphatically, while Donald Trump was running for president on the basis of saying that he wanted to build a wall, Mick Mulvaney is on the record saying that this whole idea of building a fence or a wall that Donald Trump was trying to sell to people on emotional terms, he's out there on the record calling it pablum, calling it absurd and almost childish for somebody running for president to be proposing something that simplistic. He's the guy who's going to run the White House and organize everything during what the president is hoping and rooting for as to be a long shutdown, specifically over the issue of him not getting his wall. But the shutdown is going to happen. Our closest allies around the world spent the day reeling in response to the surprise protest resignation of Defense Secretary James Mattis last night. The United States Supreme Court today, in a 5-4 ruling, brushed back President Trump on one of his policy changes that was designed to make it impossible for anyone to seek asylum in this country. On a normal day, the big headline about that Supreme Court ruling would be that Chief Justice John Roberts joined the more liberal judges on the court to come up with that 5-4 majority. But today, the real headline out of that ruling, other than the ruling itself, is that liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to cast that vote just before she went into the hospital for surgery today. She is 85 years old. We will have more on that coming up. But on days like this, when it feels like the foundations are a little shaky, I firmly believe we can take comfort in the little things, right? Like a nutshellable, case study style, self-dealing, self-enrichment, public corruption scam, old school style, involving the Deputy White House Chief of Staff. That makes sense, right? I know how that ends. In terms of order and the rule of law and things proceeding one foot in front of the other, in terms of how our government operates, you should also know that even if the government does shut down for an extended period starting tonight, law enforcement doesn't shut down. At the federal level, law enforcement is considered a critical and essential function. You should also know that as a specific matter, the special counsel's office and within the Justice Department, Robert Mueller and his prosecutors, their office will also not shut down in a federal government shutdown. There's been a whole bunch of interesting court filings related to the Mueller probe today. I will tell you, we're going to get to that a little bit later on this hour, too, including the lifting of the gag order in the Maria Butina case. I am slightly obsessed with that case and that element of it. We will have more on that coming up. But the Mueller investigation, the special counsel's office, again, will not shut down in the shutdown. Let us also take comfort in buffeting times like this, in the clarifying, orderly science of good reporting and the clear explication of even complex processes. And so tonight we're going to try to figure out a lot of the most complex stuff that's going on, including us starting with a live report from Capitol Hill on what is now the impending, I believe it's the third government shutdown of the Donald Trump presidency. We're going to go live to Capitol Hill to try to understand how long this shutdown is likely to last right after this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.